When asked, "What is a man?" Plato responded with a featherless biped, and Diogenes, always quick to humiliate Plato, brandishes a fully plucked chicken and proclaims, "Behold, a man," which just goes to show that even 500 years before the birth of Christ, discussions of genre contained a lot of Socratic method trolling. But it's not exclusively pedantic ping-pong in the ivory tower, and there's a ton of great histories, studies, and analysis of genre written all the time. Most recently, the YouTube channel Innuendo Studios had a wonderful meditation on genre filtered through the lens of adventure games, and Kotaku's Joshua Rivera published the controversial article "Stop Calling Games Metroidvania," a prescriptivist criticism of the genre label that in a roundabout way actually brings us back to Diogenes. See, Diogenes was a cynic, which in Greek philosophy meant an intense love of Socratic virtue, and that virtue alone was sufficient to sustain a man. The complexities of civilization got in the way of understanding virtue, so the cynics preached an austere lifestyle that rejected fame, wealth, and power. Living in accordance with nature, as understood by human reason, was critical to achieving the mental clarity needed to live a virtuous life. So if you take this gross oversimplification of cynic philosophy, you can notice some parallels between Diogenes' beliefs and Rivera's argument against the term Metroidvania. It's an overcomplicated portmanteau of two game titles most people can't easily access. On top of that, it's an unnatural way to name a genre constantly at odds with the mechanical labels you traditionally use, and it creates hurdles for people new to games to join the conversation. I think Rivera's intentions here are noble, and it's important to think about the words we use when talking about games, but I disagree with this thesis, and losing Metroidvania risks making games discourse more vague and as a result, less accessible. Genre is a huge topic, so I'm going to organize this video into discrete parts rather than address Rivera's article directly, since I think that'll make for more interesting discussion. So let's get started. Have you ever really thought about how people actually learn about genres anyways? My earliest memory is from the first grade, where a librarian walked us through the difference between fiction and nonfiction, and then asked us with finding examples of each. Beyond that, the bulk of my formal genre education came from music, theater, or art history classes I took in high school and college, since they organized around the ebb and flow of different movements within those mediums. Most literature courses didn't cover genre directly, so the vast majority of my education on genre has been informal, either by talking with friends or by looking it up on my own. It's been a mostly painless affair, but I also seek out media histories on purpose, so I'm more than happy to engage with genre discussions on their own terms. That doesn't mean I don't face hurdles, or that the hurdles are trivial, it just means that I'm more willing to work past those hurdles than others. By far, the largest obstacle to engaging with the media community isn't which words they use, but the mere reality of needing to learn a new language just to wade into a discussion. Using anime as an example, you're literally learning a new language as key terms of art are mostly Japanese loanwords and phrases. Hell, if The Princess of Mars was ever adapted into an anime, people would most likely categorize it as an isekai, rather than labeling it as a planetary romance. However, most of the time, you're learning some variation of your native language, so it's easy enough to intuit the vocabulary, at least initially. As you get more familiar with the media's language, you'll run into all kinds of weird vocabulary that will flip that intuition upside down, or just block it entirely. For example, I know that the J in JRPG stands for Japanese, and I can intuit that a JRPG is a role-playing game with Japanese sensibilities, but I can't intuit much more than that. If I wanted to know what Japanese design sensibilities were, or whether it was possible to make a JRPG outside of Japan, I would need to look up an article or ask a friend. But the word here doesn't really matter. It's the act of categorization itself that forces particular words and phrases to develop arcane precision. It's an inevitable part of the growth of a medium, and it's probably better to embrace the weird and unique labels people come up with. Otherwise, you'll end up with a lot of vague, almost interchangeable genres that do more to frustrate and confuse discussions than foster them. Just check out the Gaming Brits show's frustration over the term character action as an example of that. Furthermore, trying to remove initial hurdles through genre simplification also misses a very important reality of media discussions. They're not unlocked by knowing a critical mass of keywords and phrases, but are made evident as a person grows in their own media experiences. You don't need to know what the word Metroidvania or isekai means to start talking about your relationship with a work of art. And most people start talking about art without ever really stepping foot into the labyrinthine discourse on genre. Again, people aren't intimidated by the words or the phrases that we use to describe the peculiarities of a medium, but the very fact that we choose to use any particular word or phrase to describe those peculiarities. People engage with media at their own pace. If they want to dive into genre, they will. Or they'll just ignore it until they need to look up games similar to the ones they like. But at the end of the day, even the willingness of hyper-enthusiastic nerds to dive into the minutiae of genre labels isn't sustainable if the community built around art is toxic, or if the resources necessary to grow are hard to come by. So instead of relying on the industry or critics or engaged fans to fill in the gaps, maybe we should provide more resources for game, film, TV, and comic literacy to be taught in grade school. It's just a thought. Generally speaking, genre is a shorthand used by people in order to talk about media that is similar in form, subject, or style. As a result, genre labels are constantly mediated by various institutions that make up a broader community. There isn't a centralized government for game genres, so categories can literally come from anywhere. For example, the simulation genre got its label from a series of games released by Codemasters in the mid-80s. Metroidvania was coined by Scott Sharkey and Jeremy Parrish at One Up magazine, and the term first-person shooter rose to prominence through Usenet forums sometime between the release of Duke Nukem 3D and the original Half-Life. Any and all of these institutions come up with competing genre labels and definitions until something wins out as the genre label du jour, which ripples retroactively to encompass discussions about older games as well. But that's the usual end result. At the start, a genre doesn't exist until the games do, and even then it could take a while before a label even shows up. The first-person shooter can be traced as far back as 1973's Maze War, but the genre wasn't fully established until after the release of 1993's Doom. Tons of developers tried to cash in on Doom's success and popularity by putting out their own take on Doom's core mechanics, or even just reskinning the original game. The enthusiast community started referring to these games as Doom clones as a pejorative because most of these games were either derivative or just sloppily reskinned slop. Some gaming publications also adopted the genre title in a more neutral capacity, but there was a noticeable refusal to adopt the label on the part of the industry, preferring to categorize their games as first-person adventures or even shoot-em-ups. Usage of the term Doom clone peaked in 1996, but by then, Doom clones have fully evolved away from the pejorative to just be the handy label used to describe a lot of unique and interesting games inspired by Doom. The term first-person shooter existed during this whole time as well, but didn't gain a lot of traction until 96, eventually overtaking Doom clone as the default genre label in 1998, and the rest is history. Of course, there's far more to the 25-year development of the FPS label, and I'll link a couple of scholarly articles if you want to go into more detail, but considering this is one well-documented example, it serves as a good reference point. And you can see a fairly clear pattern. Before we even think about genre, we only have a handful of games with a fairly unique identity, then a landmark title iterating on these mechanics sells like gangbusters and triggers a gold rush of copycats by major studios hoping to bank in on the game's popularity. The landmark stands as a definitive experience, however, and discussions about any future releases center it either as an easy shorthand or a measuring stick. Eventually the copycats get good, and the once dominant landmark either can't quite capture the now fledgling genre or gets surpassed by the new titles. It's at this point that one of two things happen. Either the old label gets replaced with something more generic, like how GTA clone eventually gave way to open world games, or the label sticks around, potentially with some small modifications, like how Souls-like grew into Soulsborne. On the surface, which genres get genericized and which keep their flair seems kind of arbitrary. There's nothing that meaningfully ties Metroidvanias and roguelikes together, and that's not even getting into genres that look generic but are actually referencing a particular game, like how the adventure game label used to describe LucasArts and Sierra-style games is actually reference to Will Crowther's Colossal Cave Adventure. But if you step back a little, the initial reaction to a game-based label says a lot about its potential longevity. Remember, the runaway success of a landmark title inspires a lot of new games centered around its core mechanics or themes. Usually AAA or similarly experienced developers start chasing the new market first, since they have the resources necessary to churn out a highly polished product in a short amount of time. But it's the product's marketing that interests us here. When chasing a trend, studios have a couple of options to sell their game. The first is to create as much distance as possible from the genre leader and position the game as its own unique experience born from the visionary genius of veteran developers. For example, Duke Nukem 3D was sold as a 3D shoot-'em-up, but people aren't PR drones and will call out the trend chasing when they see it. Doubly so if the supposed visionary genius results in a derivative and mediocre imitation, like Chex Quest. This results in tensions between how the industry describes their game and how the community at large discusses it. Something has to give, and since the industry has the vested interest in at least steering the conversation away from the landmark title, discussions eventually converge on the most popular adopted generic label. Of course, that's if studios choose to position their games that way. They could also opt to take the opposite approach and lean into the comparisons. Just think of all the times some developer directly referenced or even claimed their game was the next Dark Souls. They invite this association in hopes of borrowing the positive feelings people have for Rogue or Super Metroid, while also communicating a dense set of expectations. Plus, it lands up really nicely with how people commonly hunt for new games. More often than not, people look for or suggest games by referencing whatever they've played before. If I'd recently fallen in love with Far Cry Blood Dragon, I'm not going to tell people I'm looking for a science fiction, first-person shooter with an immediately accessible open world. If I'd recently fallen in love with Far Cry Blood Dragon, I'm not going to tell people I'm looking for a science fiction, first-person shooter with an immediately accessible open world, extensive weapon upgrades, and driving mechanics all wrapped up in a glowing neon pastiche of 80s action movies. I'm just going to say I'm looking for games like Far Cry Blood Dragon. This becomes self-reinforcing as both industry and community discussions center around the game label, and gives it a lot more staying power than when the industry and broader community are at odds over how they talk about a genre. Granted, this is a very rigid explanation of how genre labels come about. The reality is a fair bit messier. Genres are metamorphic chimeras built from the collected musings of millions of passionate people touched in millions of ways by art that shares a common style. Even when consensus stands for years, people constantly challenge convention in the hopes of greater precision, accessibility, or any other number of infinite reasons to move the conversation in a new direction. What gets popular, what stays popular, and what becomes an academic footnote follow a couple of broad trends, but you don't have to take my word for it, and I'm still going to link a couple of academic articles on video game genre histories in the description below.
So, here's a hot take for you. The revival and subsequent explosion of 2D adventure platformers was made possible because of the existence of the term Metroidvania. This may sound like a contradiction when I said earlier that which words we reserve for specific definitions doesn't matter, just the act of giving certain words special meaning creates barriers to entry. And I still stand by that. The initial hurdle is going to be equally difficult to overcome no matter what words we use. But once you get to the hang of things, word choice has an impact far beyond a straightforward association with an archaic definition. This is because the words we use to label genres guide the conversations that define them, which in turn influences the way we apply genre as a framework, both when analyzing art and making it. Strict labels create clear frameworks to experiment in, but can also act as a prison hostile to creativity. Broad ones provide an infinite canvas, but often lack the focus to be anything more than a bucket to sort stuff in. And the best illustration of what I mean is found by diving into the phrase Metroidvania and its most common alternative. One of the funnier criticisms of the term Metroidvania is that it's a made-up word because it's a mashup of two video game titles that were themselves mashups of a couple of unrelated words. Now, ignoring the fact that all words are made up and that we denominalize made-up brand labels like Google and Photoshop all the time, I'd like to point out that the highly specific etymology of Metroidvania works heavily in its favor if you value precise and narrow use of genre, whereas phrases like action exploration or adventure platformer opens a biblical amount of room for interpretation. Metroidvania pegs the genre to two specific games, the original Metroid on the NES and Castlevania Symphony of the Night for the original PlayStation. If I told you I was working on a Metroidvania, I have just communicated to you a CVS receipt's worth of mechanics and design sensibilities. You'd know that the game contains some kind of platforming, a large area that requires finding special power-ups in order to fully explore, combat, plus a side-scrolling 2D perspective. And that's just the super condensed elevator pit. The nitty-gritty of Metroid's and Castlevania's shared design includes breaking up their open world into distinct segments or rooms and connecting them using doors, some of which can only be unlocked with special abilities or items. On top of that are respawning any defeated monsters whenever you re-enter a room, hidden items, and an unreasonable amount of other details that would take too long to fully spell out. The Metroidvania label's tight association with two specific games makes this dense communication possible, and that's super cool. But there's a dark side to privileging a particular game or two. While Metroidvania richly communicates its expectations and acts as a kind of development North Star, it doesn't allow much room for radical experimentation. For example, how important is the camera perspective? Are we locked into seeing our character move from side to side in profile, or is it possible to still be a Metroidvania in a third-person isometric, or even first-person view? If the camera is mutable, then what else can we strip away before we lose the genre's identity? The label doesn't provide a lot of leeway here because both Metroid and Castlevania share the same perspective. Any deviation risks jettisoning you from the consideration and serious discussion, and what gets you kicked out can feel kind of arbitrary. Take Metroid Prime and Batman Arkham Asylum. The former is usually grandfathered into the genre as one of, or even the only example of a first-person Metroidvania because of its association with the original Metroid, while the latter bounces between a full part of the genre to a spin-off that doesn't quite belong with the other games because of its perspective or relative linearity or stealth mechanics or any number of other reasons. It's an awkward tension born out of the genre label's laser-like focus on a couple of games that were released in the 90s. Of course, that limitation could be seen as a feature rather than a bug, especially if you want narrow definitions of genre. But what if you don't? What if you want the conversation to go beyond Hollow Knight and Guacamelee to include Rogue Legacy and Dark Souls, or you feel like the essence of the genre is less about the tight adherence to a specific set of design principles, but more the experience of exploring an interconnected world with monsters to kill and powers to acquire? The label Metroidvania could be stretched to accommodate these ideas, but Metroid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night will always act as a center of gravity that pulls a genre inward. If you want a bigger genre, then you're better off hunting for a different genre label. This is of course the innate benefit of a more generic language term like open world platformer or search action for the genre. Instead of centering everything around a game or two, these labels provide a blank canvas by which people can project their own meaning based on the games they've played that intuitively fit the label. I may not have played Metroid Fusion or Castlevania Aria of Sorrow, but Axiom Verge and Monster Tales should still give me an idea as to what the genre is about. It's also flexible, so people don't have to go wringing their hands over including the close enough games. Plus, straightforward phrases like 2D exploration look less weird than Metroidvania or Souls-like. There's a simplicity to generic labels that crushes the inherent weakness of a game-centered term. But just as terms like exploration platformer avoid the pitfalls of Metroidvania, they also fail to capture the latter's dense communication and firm boundaries. Generic terms are great for providing a lot of room for experimentation, but do a really poor job of keeping things out, and as a result provide very weak, if any, guidance. I'll focus on the phrase action-adventure platformer or just adventure platformer because it's the alternative that I've seen the most in both journalistic and advertising media, and because most generic labels tend to be similarly problematic even if their exact details differ. At first blush, adventure platformer is deceptively straightforward. It evokes a sort of fusion of both action-adventure games and platformers that has a firm footing in both of its parent genres. It doesn't just ask you to maneuver through an obstacle course of spikes, death pits, and fireballs in a ballet of digital parkour. It also puts you at the center of a world worth saving and plundering for both secrets and loot. But how do you actually go about building a game like that? What are the minimum number of platforms we need for our action-adventure to qualify? How much adventure does our hero need to go in order to be more than just a platformer? If we try to define the two parts intuitively, we can take action-adventure to mean a mixture of puzzles and combat that challenge the player to master a particular set of systems. A prime example is The Legend of Zelda, which has you exploring vast open world and diving into dungeons that yield treasures necessary to progress deeper into the dark. Likewise, a platformer is a game that requires a player to get from one point to another while maneuvering around a series of obstacles normally designed to kill or frustrate the player. The classic example is of course the original Donkey Kong, though Jumpman's originally vertical climb is much less common than his future side-scrolling challengers under the name Mario. Put them together and it's pretty easy to see how a game like Metroid can embody the best of both games. Of course, things aren't so simple. Action-adventure games have a long history of appropriating mechanics, and while the original Legend of Zelda is almost bereft of platforming elements, many of the 3D installments liberally pepper them throughout the world, so it's an open question whether it's enough to graduate into the adventure platformer hybrid genre. The Mario franchise itself isn't either. The 2D installments are an easy exclusion, but the 3D platformers like Super Mario Odyssey and Super Mario 364 both have huge open worlds to explore and often task you with solving combat puzzles or just litter the level with Goombas. You could try and handwave that problem by pegging those games to either their original franchise genres, but that still leaves a ton of games in a very close orbit. For example, the entire Ratchet & Clank franchise is built off overpowered gun combat and exploring each world through increasingly complex platforming. Donkey Kong 64 is in a similar boat, and both games have all kinds of hidden secrets that usually reward power-ups of some sort. Things get even murkier when we look at some of the more recent AAA action-adventure games like Assassin's Creed or Horizon Zero Dawn. Their platforming and other traversal mechanics generally involve simplified inputs compared to Ratchet & Clank or even Metroid, but they're still a core part of how these games present their challenge, and those are all games with hugely open level design. I haven't even touched on more linear experiences like Mega Man, Uncharted, and Contra, or any number of other games with a heavy mix of platforming and action-adventure. The term is broad and just as, if not more likely to grab something you didn't really intend. As a result, you can't rely on the genre to guide you through the rocky seas of development, and you're back navigating with a couple of games you most likely want to emulate or striking out into unknown waters. Now, it's entirely fair to accuse me of being pedantic, and that I'm placing an unnecessary amount of emphasis on labels. We already have a pile of games we want to associate, so all we have to do is pick a sophisticated enough definition that perfectly boxes in the games that we want while keeping the ones that we don't out. That way, when we slap a generic phrase like action platformer onto the box, we can get the best of both worlds. An inoffensive label that cuts to the core of the genre without requiring a lot of experience, and a precise definition that acts as a strong blueprint for people wanting to explore the genre's design philosophies. And this is true, but only for really invested academic types like me. If you cut down a broad category by legally constructing a very narrow meaning, you just end up throwing away whatever intuitiveness the generic label had and create a frustrating situation where less engaged people get told Uncharted doesn't count as an adventure platformer because it's not similar enough to either Metroid or Castlevania Symphony of the Night. But this only happens if you try to have your cake and eat it too. I do appreciate the desire to build the perfect genre by working backwards from the games we have today, but often people fail to appreciate the associations category they have constructed creates. It gets hand-waved away as messy pedantry, but I think we should embrace the mess rather than run from it. We should look at genres as more than just a list of related games, and instead as tools to help both build and evaluate them. As a result, whenever we try to intentionally build or even just label a genre, we should have a clear idea of what we value. Maybe you want a broad genre that connects long history of titles, or a narrow one that densely communicates communicates a design philosophy, or you want the genre to evoke themes of narrative instead of game feel and mechanical identity. Whatever your values, stick to them and build with purpose. I, for one, value narrow and dense genre labels and definitions. I feel that they're more useful as blueprints for designers while also fine-tuning the expectations of critics and players to better appreciate those experiences. This is why I like the term Metroidvania, even if I might awkwardly exclude a lot of the close enough games. It's also why, if you put a gun to my head and force me to advocate for a generic language label, I'd suggest open world platformer. It captures every game that would trivially fall under Metroidvania, and while it removes combat as a point of consideration, I feel that's fine. Games that de-emphasize or even remove combat while innovating on level design and traversal would do more to contribute and inspire more traditional Metroidvanias than trying to shoehorn in combat in the genre label. Plus, the existence of open world platformers implies the existence of one or more platforming subgenres with different level design philosophies in mind. This allows games like Mega Man and Super Mario Bros. And many of the pre-Symphony Castlevania games to exist in their own category separate from, but still related to more traditional Metroidvanias. I think that's great, but that's just me though.
In the process of writing this video, I ended up coming across a couple of articles that blew open my perspective a little bit. The first is, Are Game Genres Useful? By Asa Reyes. In it, Reyes points out that game genres like first-person shooter don't help them pick games they might enjoy, but instead drive them away from play experiences they know bore or frustrate them. In fact, Reyes specifically calls out Castlevania as a game series they missed out on until they watched the recent Netflix adaptation, because the term Metroidvania doesn't communicate the kinds of stories that normally accompany the genre's combat and platforming. Reyes values games and narrative experiences, so the industry's and broader community's focus on mechanically evocative labels leaves them lost and rudderless. It's not all roses for mechanically inclined genres either. I love strategy games, but it's sometimes very difficult to find a consistent gameplay experience even within subgenres. Take XCOM and Advance Wars. Both of them are turn-based strategy games, but they couldn't be further from each other. Advance Wars plays out almost like a souped-up version of chess or Risk that sees you claiming cities and fighting with combined forces of planes, boats, tanks, and infantry. Your armies are faceless and often enough disposable. But XCOM works on an entirely different scale, putting you in control of a single squad of hardened soldiers you grow attached to through intense customization, and that you risk losing forever every time you go on a mission. If I'm looking for one kind of experience over the other, then I'm going to have to dig a lot deeper than whatever genre the developer slapped on the box. Which leads me to the second article, Make Stuff and Be Free to Vanish Without a Trace, by Liz Ryerson. Now, Ryerson isn't actually talking about genre directly, but more the lack of any sort of coherent art movements across game development, and how this is both born from and results in a hugely limited vocabulary when it comes to talking about games. This constrained language feeds back on itself, and it's not helped by Ryerson's observation that most game design university programs are very practice-oriented. By itself, this isn't a bad thing. Practice is a great way to learn and find your voice in a medium, but when the vast majority of our work inhabiting Steam and itch.io are the practice pieces of students and enthusiastic amateurs, you end up with a flood of games that are almost impossible to reasonably sift through or even say something meaningful about. Now, Ryerson's article focuses on how these trends impact artists, and how this trend towards maker culture leaves a lot of marginalized artists vulnerable to wealthy interests because the later are better able to muscle their way into success while paradoxically being free of relying on the brutality of the market to survive. Now, that sort of analysis is a little bit beyond the scope of this essay, but it's important to remember that the way we talk about games ripples out to the people who make them as well. How this pertains to genre is pretty straightforward. Cultural movements tend toward a specific philosophy or goal, and the artists at the forefront drive the conversation around their art along these lines. These conversations then later inform whatever genres the movement gives birth to. But without these conversations, artists get lost in the discussion, and that's kind of sad. But the main point I want to make with these two articles is that the genre, at least as it stands now, fails to meet people's needs in a lot of different ways. Now, a lot of people generally propose solutions along the lines of either burning it down and starting over, or tweaking what we have to make it more usable. However, I don't think the problem of genre is one of precision and utility, but rather scale and perspective. It's always tempting to take a seat at the top of the ivory tower when talking about games. It's why we have concepts like flow and game feel, which try to bridge the ocean of mechanics and styles in the medium, and on the flip side we have wonderfully deep dives into the minutiae of a particular game or franchise. But a lot of the middle ground in games discussions is fairly underexplored. Even genre discussions tend to take the view from the top with very little time spent exploring smaller segments or subgenres. This can have dire consequences for games as we're left ill-equipped to engage with certain titles in good faith, or worse, might apply an inappropriate framework when trying to evaluate a game. Just look at the critical pounding Pathologic 2 received upon release. It wasn't until less mainstream reviewers with greater familiarity with both the source material and previous game that a kind of course correction occurred, and Pathologic 2 started making waves in GOG and Steam sales charts. Most critics didn't have the conceptual framework to evaluate Pathologic 2 on its own terms, partly because it was a bleak and weird Russian survival horror game, and partly because its default genre places it in the same group as Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and Fatal Frame. Games with very different aesthetic and design sensibilities that Pathologic 2 doesn't share. In that light, it's trivial to see Pathologic 2 as a bad example of the genre when it's not trying to actually fit into the category in the first place. Switching over to a narrative genre might help, because then you'll be able to label Pathologic 2 as weird fiction, which places it in the same boat as Call of Cthulhu and The Sinking City, but that doesn't really provide much context for how the game plays. Anyone jumping into Pathologic 2 from either of the other games might have a good time, but could also be frustrated by its difficulty and intricate web of impenetrable mechanics. Pathologic and its sequel defy a lot of categorization, so maybe we should try to build a home for them instead. Pathologic 2 is a survival game that tasks you with curing the local townsfolk, all while navigating its complex economic and reputation systems, without also succumbing to the supernatural forces that plague the town. It may not be survival horror, but maybe it's survival weird. It's not supposed to be scary as much as supposed to be unsettling, and it's not like there is a genre of one, with both Pathologic games sitting by themselves. They're kept good company with a game like Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl, another title that leans heavily on complex survival and supernatural elements to tell a bleak story in the aftermath of a second nuclear disaster at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. But the particulars of Pathologic aside, the point I'm trying to make is that no matter how we choose to organize genre, our current scope is too small to accommodate experimental, offbeat, or ambitious games that defy convention, while also failing to guide people to the sorts of experiences that they desire. We don't need better genres, we need more genres, and honestly, it doesn't matter how we build it. Want to focus on narrative experiences when trying to describe games? Go for it. Feel like pinning everything to a marquee title that follow-up games should strive to emulate? Eat your heart out. We have plenty of room to provide all kinds of frameworks to build and appreciate games. There's no reason why genre should be limited to the uneven collection of broad categories and hyper-specific labels we currently have. If this hodgepodge growth causes some genres to evolve into a beautiful chimera of narrative, mechanical, and camera perspective labels, then game discussions will all be the better for it. So go forth and build genres. And thanks for watching.